All right, we are recording. So just a quick reminder, quiz 3 is tomorrow on Friday. Quiz 4, which I will post in the outline over the weekend, but just so you know what's coming, quiz 4 will be next Tuesday, which I think is June 2nd. All right, so when we left off last time, we were talking about bone remodeling and some topics. I jotted down a few notes right before I opened it. When I sat down this morning to open up, it's sort of half review and maybe a term that I didn't mention yesterday. So in the process of bone remodeling, in layman's terms, quickly what that means is making new bone and getting rid of old bone. So that's what bone remodeling means. And it occurs in all of us, even in adults throughout life. We have some sort of bone remodeling going on in our bodies all the time. Now, specifically, I'm going to call up a whiteboard here. Specifically, under the category or the term of bone remodeling, what that involves is, I don't know why I have a blue pen starting out today, but I'll go with it. Bone deposit, that means making new bone tissue. And then bone resorption, which is getting rid of old bone tissue. So we're still talking about bone remodeling, but bone deposit, I'm just going to write new, ossification, and say a few things about that. You know what this means. Osteoblast activity is active, making new bone. But what I haven't said so far is that it takes about 1 week for this process, for new bone to really solidify or get hardened in the body. So it takes about 1 week, I'm going to say, for osteoid, which is that organic material secreted by osteoblasts. So I'm going to put osteoblasts in parentheses, to mix and harden with calcium and phosphate. So I'm going to put a big P in parentheses, I'll write phosphate. So calcium and phosphate are the two major players in the inorganic minerals that harden bone. Here's what happens. The critical, what we think as scientists is the critical factor in actually causing new bone tissue to get hard or harden is when the concentration, and if you can't read this, just ask me, I don't mind. It's really difficult for me to write legibly on this screen, but the critical factor is when the concentration of the minerals, that means the calcium and phosphate, so I'll write in parentheses, calcium and P, phosphate. So when the minerals reach a certain level of concentration, when the concentration of minerals, I'm going to say, get to a certain level, then we get crystallization and hardness of bone tissue. That's supposed to be, let me erase that. So that's bone deposit. Real quickly, what happens is blood vessels bring calcium, the minerals, calcium and phosphate, to an area. They deposit it in that area. And then the osteoblasts in that area secrete that organic matrix called osteoid. That organic sort of goo matrix mixes with these minerals and causes the tissue to harden. And it's when these minerals, calcium and phosphate, reach a certain level of concentration that we get this crystallization or hardness in the bone tissue. So that's bone deposit. The second part of bone remodeling is called bone resorption. So I'm going to go to a new screen and just write. So bone remodeling includes the process of bone deposit, which is ossification, and bone resorption, R-E-S-O-R-P-T-I-O-N. This is actually the removal or the dissolving of old bone tissue. So in this case, we have osteoclast activity. Those are the big cells that dissolve bone tissue. Occurs along the surface of bone. And actually bone deposit usually occurs along the inner or outer surface of bone as well. But these osteoclasts are these big, huge, they're large multinucleate cells, and they sort of patrol along the surfaces of our bones, dissolving bone tissue where necessary. And they secrete enzymes and acids that break down bone matrix. And the purpose for that is they get rid of bone tissue where we're not using it, where it's not needed. So, and then this process of breaking down bone matrix actually then releases calcium ions from storage. So I'm going to put releases calcium into the blood. That's where other organs and other physiologic processes can use that calcium, is when it's in the blood. That's where calcium is available, for example, for a nerve cell to use calcium, or heart muscle to use calcium, or skeletal muscle to use calcium. So before I get off this topic, calcium is the most used mineral in the human body. And I'm going to give you a short list of some processes that the body uses ionic calcium. I put the 2 pluses around it because that's in its ion form. So I need some more space. I'm going to layer on here. The body uses calcium to do, this is just a short list. Every time a muscle contracts in the human body, we use calcium. So think, every time your heart beats, we use calcium. Every time you move a skeletal muscle, uses calcium. Also, nerve impulse transmission. When nerve cells send a signal from cell to cell, they use calcium to do that process. I'll give you a couple more. Blood coagulation. When we are bleeding and we need to stop the bleeding, it's called hemostasis. Calcium is used in order to coagulate blood. Also, cell division. Every time a cell divides, remember those stem cells that make new cells? That's supposed to be an N. Calcium is used in the process of cell division. And finally, I'm going to write gland secretion. Typically, how those secretory cells and glands that we learned about secrete their substances, they need calcium in order to perform the act of secretion. 99% of the body's calcium is stored in the bones. Okay. Technically less than 1% is in the blood. So it's actually something like, it's over 99%. It's like 99.9% is in the bones. I'm going to just say less than 1% is in the blood. But this 1%, it's not a lot of calcium, but that level is very strictly regulated by the body. All right, so I also jotted down, this is a different topic from bone remodeling, deposit, resorption. So I'm going to draw a thick line here just so that you know I'm sort of switching topics here. I think one of the very last things that I said yesterday in our meeting is that bone grows or gets deposited where there is activity or stress being put on that bone. Remember, I drew that picture of a muscle pulling on the bone. And when that occurs, it causes actually an increase in the electrical activity of the minerals. That attracts osteoblasts to that area. And then the osteoblasts start secreting new osteoid and calcium gets deposited. So bone actually grows in the area that it is stressed or that is stress put on it. That theory is called, it's named after the guy who discovered this, Wolff's Law. So I want you to just recognize that. If I use that term, Wolff's Law, on the next quiz, what I mean is that whole topic that we discussed, which is bone remodels, I'm going to put in parentheses, grows in response to the stress that's put on it. So that's what Wolff's Law states. And then it's in the last lecture and it's also in your textbook. The process of that is, first there's stress, then there's an increase in electrical activity of the minerals, then there's an attraction of osteoblasts to that area, deposit of calcium, and then we get new bone or mineralization there. Okay, so now let's move on to hormonal control of remodeling. So we know what bone remodeling now means. It means the ossification or bone growth, as well as the degradation or dissolving of old bone tissue. So I'm going to write hormonal control of remodeling. And this is largely controlled by parathyroid, it's an O, parathyroid hormone. So where does this come from? The parathyroid glands are located inside of the thyroid gland. The thyroid is in the neck, wrapped around our trachea, right below our voice box. So where your Adam's apple is, right below that, if you poke your neck, you're poking your thyroid gland. These, I'm just going to write the parathyroid glands are located inside of the thyroid, kind of on the back side of our neck, embedded in thyroid tissue. They're little pea-shaped glands. And most people have more than one. Most people have 4. Some people have 3, some people have 5, but typically people have 4. And these glands secrete parathyroid hormone. And here's the role of it. It's critical in controlling calcium levels in the blood. So here's what happens. Parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone in response, sorry, that's an S, in response to decreasing blood levels of calcium. So when our blood, it's only 1% of calcium we find in our blood, or less than 1%, it's much less than that. But when that level drops in our blood, the parathyroid glands secrete this hormone. And now I'm going to tell you what the actions are of this hormone. There's 3 main actions of this hormone that it causes blood levels to raise or rise. So I'm going to go to a new page, even though I have a little bit of white space left. I'm going to add, just because I'm going to write the actions of parathyroid hormone, PTH. I'm going to list them as 1, 2, and 3. First, PTH stimulates osteoclast with a C activity. What is the purpose of this hormone? It's to raise the levels of blood calcium. And so if we stimulate osteoclast activity, that unlocks stored calcium from the bone. So remember, osteoclasts, they dissolve bone matrix. And when that occurs, that releases calcium from the bone into the blood. We have all this calcium stored in our bones, but we can't use it unless it's in our blood. So we can't use it for other things. So it's sort of stored in our bones under lock and key. And these cells that degrade or dissolve bone tissue unlock the calcium from the stored form in our bones. So it stimulates osteoclast activity. I'm going to say to dissolve bone matrix and then release calcium from that bone matrix into the blood. So I'm going to put in parentheses, or put a star here and say that increases calcium blood levels. So that's the first action of PTH. The second one is that it increases calcium absorption in the small intestine. I'll explain after I write this. And most of that occurs in the ileum section of the small intestine, but that's not critical at this point. So when we don't make calcium, we have to ingest it in our diet. It's a required mineral that we need in order to live, to function. When we eat calcium or drink it in some form or another, we have to absorb that calcium across our digestive tract wall in order for it to get into our bloodstream. This hormone, when it's released, increases calcium absorption across the wall of the small intestine. So you can eat calcium all day, but you don't actually get it into your bloodstream unless your small intestine absorbs it across the wall. And this hormone increases the absorption process. So that also increases calcium blood levels. And finally, number 3, PTH decreases calcium excretion in the kidneys. Our kidneys filter the blood. Basically, that's one of their main functions. And the stuff that we don't need or we have excess of or that is dangerous in our blood, the kidneys filter out and we get rid of in our urine. So whenever we have excess calcium in the blood, that leaves our urine if we don't need it. But when PTH is secreted from the parathyroid glands, this hormone signals the kidneys to decrease excretion of calcium in the urine. That way our body holds on to that calcium, and so that ultimately increases calcium blood levels as well. So you can see all 3 of these actions increase calcium blood levels. So that hormone, parathyroid hormone, is probably the major player in hormonal regulation of calcium levels. This hormone, calcitonin, is a different hormone, and we're not really sure what it does, and it doesn't have a huge impact on blood levels of calcium, but all textbooks always mention it. Calcitonin is actually released by the thyroid gland, not the parathyroid glands. And we think it has minimal effect, but it may actually decrease blood calcium levels. So I'm just going to write in parentheses, may decrease. It's not nearly as effective as parathyroid hormone. The last, I'm going to call up a new board here, and the last hormone that your book, I believe, mentions is serotonin. This is a hormone that you've probably heard of it before. It regulates our mood. It elevates our mood level, as well as it helps regulate our sleep cycles as well. Serotonin, here's basically what happens. When we eat food, serotonin is secreted into the blood. It's part of the good mood feeling from eating. Okay, so when serotonin is secreted into the blood, this serotonin in the blood then actually makes its way to our bones, and it interferes with osteoblast activity. So I'm going to put into the blood, then it makes its way to our bones. Where it interferes with osteoblast activity. That means that also helps keep calcium levels high in the blood. Osteoblast activity, osteoblasts build new bones, so they use calcium, take calcium out of the blood to build bone. Osteoclasts, they degrade or dissolve bone tissue, and that raises blood calcium levels. So this ultimately keeps calcium blood levels up when serotonin is released. Okay, I'm going to start moving on now to a little bit into 6.7 and 6.8, which will not be on the quiz that you're going to have. You know what? this will be on the quiz, so I need to cover this. I'm just gonna, I don't want to not cover anything that we have time to cover. So I'm just gonna write other dietary effects on bone. Then the last thing I'll talk about today is healing of bone fracture, which won't be on the quiz. So other dietary effects on bone will be on the quiz tomorrow. I'm just going to do a list. Vitamin D3, which is, you know now, is made by our skin. When sunlight UV rays hit our skin, it makes vitamin D. So this is synthesized in our skin, but it's an inactive form. We can also ingest vitamin D. If we don't get enough sunlight, the whole reason that a long time ago, we started fortifying our milk that we drink with vitamin D and other products is in case we don't get enough sunlight and we don't make enough vitamin D, then we can also absorb it in our GI tract. Nevertheless, vitamin D3 is called cholecalciferol. This is the inactive form that is synthesized in the skin. When UV light hits our skin, it makes this cholecalciferol. Then this cholecalciferol gets converted to an active form by the kidneys. And that's called calcitriol. And what calcitriol does then is it enhances calcium and phosphate absorption in the small intestine. So it helps provide calcium and phosphate for new bone growth. So it enhances calcium and phosphate absorption in the small intestine. So vitamin D3 plays a role in bone health by enabling us to absorb calcium and phosphate, which are required for new bone tissue. So I'm going to mention just, I'll say what vitamin C does, maybe vitamin A, and a couple other hormones, and we'll be done with the information for tomorrow's quiz. So vitamin C, this is also called ascorbic acid. Vitamin C does all sorts of great things in our body, but how it affects our bones, that's supposed to say it's necessary for collagen synthesis. Collagen is that really tough protein, and we find collagen fibers in bone tissue that gives bones some flexibility when stress is put on them. So vitamin C is necessary for collagen synthesis, and it also increases osteoblast differentiation. That word differentiation you'll hear throughout A&P. It just means turning into something else. So when new osteoblasts are formed from stem cells, those osteogenic cells, vitamin C assists in that process. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the term scurvy. It's not used so much anymore because it's not as popular anymore. This disease scurvy is from a lack of vitamin C. And it causes a loss of bone mass, really. Hundreds of years ago, when sailors would go out to sea, they'd load their boats with lemons and limes so that they wouldn't have a vitamin C deficiency when they were out at sea for months. Scurvy was common in sailors that were out at sea for months because from the lack of vitamin C, and their bones would literally get fragile and break. All right, sex hormones. That just means testosterone and estrogens. So I'll put that in parentheses. During puberty, when we get a surge of these hormones in our body, they are the main factor that is influencing bone growth during our so-called growth spurt of puberty. So they highly increase osteoblast activity. Vitamin A that we eat in foods, vegetables, increases osteoblast activity as well. All these things are good for new bone growth. Vitamins B, there's a whole complex. I'm going to just put B12 and vitamins K. I'll put a semicolon there. Vitamin B12 and vitamin K increase protein synthesis in bone. All right, let's leave it at that. So we are finished. I'm drawing a line here with what you're going to be required to know for tomorrow's quiz, quiz number 3. What I talk about from now to the end of today's meeting is going to be included on quiz number 4, which will be next Tuesday, okay? So I'm going to call up a new board. The bone diseases, which is at the end of the chapter, will be included in quiz number 4, and it will include the discussion that I mentioned yesterday of osteopenia and osteoporosis. Also, bone fracture, I'm going to go over this now, and repair will not be on tomorrow's quiz, but will be included in Tuesday's quiz. There is a certain classification that we use when a bone is broken. So I'm writing fracture classification. And it's based on this. There's 3 basic types of fracture classification. The first is by position. Okay, what that means is if the bone ends are displaced or if they are not displaced, if they're still aligned. So I'm just going to write that. If bone ends, I'll draw a picture, are displaced or still aligned. What that means is if you break a bone and the 2 ends are displaced like this, or if they're still aligned like this. The second factor for classification is whether if the fracture is complete or incomplete. That means if the break goes all the way through, or it's just a crack and does not go through. So I'm just going to write all the way through the bone, and in parentheses I'm going to say or not. And that would be something like this. If the fracture goes all the way through, it would look like this. That one would be aligned from number one. Or if the fracture just goes partway through the bone like this, that would be complete or incomplete. And finally, number 3 is whether or not the fracture is closed or open. Open, we also use the word compound. And that just means if the bone ends are coming through the skin or not. So I'm just going to write if bone ends penetrate skin, we would call that compound, or if they don't, we would call that closed. Okay, so those are the classifications system that we use to classify bone fractures. Now I'm going to go through the stages of bone repair after a fracture. And the degree of repair, obviously, like in any damaged tissue, the degree of repair and how it's repaired depends on the degree, the severity of fracture. But here's the basic steps of how a bone heals itself. Immediately after a fracture, stage 1 or step 1 is that a hematoma forms. A hematoma is just a blood clot. So blood starts to clot, clotted blood, in the area of injury. So blood clot, I'm just going to say forms at fracture site. This is step 1. Also during this time, bone cells die in that area, living cells die, and we get inflammation. So I'm going to say the tissue swells. So that's stage 1. Stage 2, in the healing process, a fibrocartilage callus then forms. In the area of fracture. Capillaries, which are tiny blood vessels. This is the process of the fibrocartilage callus forming. Capillaries grow into the area. In that damaged fracture area, we get a surge of vascularization in the form of capillaries, these small vessels. Phagocytes clean up old dead cells or debris. This term phagocytes refers to any cell that gobbles up other tissue or other cells are called phagocytic cells. And they're usually immune type of cells like macrophages, but this word phagocytic or phagocyte just literally means to eat. So those cells clean up old dead cells in the area as well as debris. Fibroblasts and chondroblasts and stem cells, osteogenic cells, go to work. So they invade this area and start laying down new bone tissue. I'm just going to say new tissue, because first we get fibroblasts. They're immature cells that secrete fibers. Chondroblasts are immature cartilage cells that secrete new cartilage. And finally, these osteogenic cells are stem cells that start to literally form new osteoblasts in that area. So first we get a fibrocartilaginous callus forming a splint on the broken bone. I'll draw a picture after I finish writing these stages. There's just 4 stages. So fibrocartilage, callus forms a splint around the broken bone. So if we have a broken bone, let's say it's aligned, what's going on during this stage, this fibrocartilage callus formation, is capillaries grow into the area. So I'm just going to draw some blood vessels coming in, new blood vessels around this area. They bring nutrition, oxygen, and calcium, things that are needed to heal the tissue and form new tissue. And a fibrocartilage callus forms around this broken area like this. Literally like a miniature cast that's going to hold this, stabilize and hold this broken area. So what I have in blue is really a fibrocartilage callus that helps mend that area. Now I'm going to go on and finish this business up. So I'm just going to write number 3. I'll go back to my black pen. A bony callus, bony tissue then just replaces that cartilage tissue. So bony callus forms and what happens is literally fibrocartilage gets converted into spongy bone. Back when I talked about ossification, I said quite a few times, spongy bone usually almost always grows first in an area. So fibrocartilage gets converted to spongy bone. Then a bony callus forms. So that blue thing that I drew on my last little picture, that splint, the tissue turns into actual ossification or bone tissue. And because we are making bone tissue from cartilage tissue, that's called endochondral ossification. Just like when we are in embryo development, only we're using fibrocartilage as a basis instead of hyaline cartilage. So endochondral ossification continues. What that term means is the conversion of cartilage to bone continues for about 2 months. And finally, the fourth and final stage is a bony callus is remodeled. So that bony callus that formed during those 2 months gets remodeled into the strong, necessary bone tissue that is needed at that site. So the last thing I'm going to say is for several months, and this usually occurs for up to a year. Some people are in casts for 6 months. It depends on the severity of the fracture. Other people can be in a cast for longer, 8 months, 12 months. But the bone remodeling that goes on after any type of serious break usually happens for at least a year. So I'm just going to write osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Activity remodels compact bone as needed. And sometimes we can even see, so here's our original broken bone. Just to go through the stages again, a blood clot forms first, all sorts of blood vessels invade the area. We get a fibrocartilage callus around that broken area to help mend and splint it. That fibrocartilage then converts to actual bone tissue. So we get spongy bone forming first, high osteoblast activity, then this spongy bone tissue in this area that I've drawn, these little spicules, these trabeculi, that gets remodeled to compact bone eventually, so that broken area mends, and sometimes we can see a remnant in this area, a tiny bit of the original fracture. Depends on the severity of that fracture. Last thing I'm going to say about this is that the new bone is usually stronger. The new bone tissue is usually stronger than older bone around it. And because of that, never is a strong word, so I'm not going to say never, but rarely do we break a bone in the same place twice. And that makes sense. If this new bone that has formed where the old fracture was, this bone where I've thickened in extra thick black marker here, that is stronger than the surrounding bone. So if this bone is subjected to trauma, serious trauma in the future, it's probably going to break here or here well before it breaks across here, because that new bone is stronger. Let me check my notes and make sure that we got to where we needed to be. And I think we did. So the whole business of bone fracture and bone repair, as well as bone diseases, will be on quiz 4. You will be responsible on the quiz tomorrow for 6.1 through 6.6. That's where I'm going to take my questions for tomorrow's quiz. But just remember that includes table 6.1, which are those bone markings. And just to give you a heads up, since you guys showed up for this meeting, I also we'll ask a few, not many, a few basic questions about bones in the human body, just to see that you're doing those lab assignments. I'm not going to ask you hard questions, but obviously the humerus or the femur is classified as a long bone. The scapula is classified as a flat bone. So I might ask you a couple questions based on specific bones and their classification or their location in the body. So you might want to just review for 5 or 10 minutes. Humerus is in the upper arm, radius and ulnar in the lower arm, carpals are wrist bones, tarsals are ankle bones, femur is in the leg, tibia, fibula is in the lower leg, the patella is the kneecap, just things like that. The mandible is the lower jaw. I'm not going to get fancy. It's just going to be a few questions. So let me cut off our recording to the cloud here.